He developed the Glycemic Index and the Portfolio Diet. For over 50 years, Dr. David Jenkins has been instrumental in the promotion of active health and food as medicine. Today, he's sharing some key clinical insights from a half-century of working on the front lines of natural health science. Educated at Oxford University, Dr. David Jenkins champions food as medicine. His life work has been to provide proof that following a specific diet can replicate the results offered by medication, often without the side effects. He is the Canada Research Chair in Nutrition and Metabolism and a member of the Faculty of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Toronto. He developed the Glycemic Index, which for many years has been used to determine the extent carbohydrates affect blood sugar, and the Portfolio Diet, designed to reduce cholesterol. He's the winner of McGill's Bloomberg Manulife Prize, presented to a researcher who's been instrumental in the promotion of active health. Dr. Jenkins champions the science and nutrition of fruits and vegetables, and he's shown that the Portfolio Diet can be as effective at lowering cholesterol as medication. And that's only one of the things that we will be talking about today. A warm welcome to Nutramedica, Dr. David Jenkins.
Thank you, Peter.
Now, in the research that I did for this program, I discovered that your work has been cited an eye-popping 65,627 times on Google Scholar alone. And your first citation was in 1982. As you look over your incredible career, tell us some of the highlights. What have been some of the highlights for you?
I think probably the highlights were, first of all, getting into med school. And secondly, all the friends I've made before and especially since then.
Well, it's clear that your values are in the right place then. Now, your research has been, incredibly influential on how we think about food, and particularly this idea of food as medicine. Maybe we can get started by talking about one of the protocols that you're most associated with, and that is the Portfolio Diet. It's recommended by the American Heart and Stroke Foundation, by the Canadian Cardiovascular Association, as well as numerous other organizations in the EU and around the world. How did you come to develop the Portfolio Diet?
My wife said, stop playing with just single foods, put them together because you'll get a much bigger effect.
So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, we're all awash in diets, from the Mediterranean diet, the Atkins, the keto diet. So what was different about your Portfolio Diet, and why do you think?
Well, I don't think, to be honest, I don't think it's particularly different from anything. I think the FDA have already allowed health claims for nuts. So's Health Canada. We've got health claims for plant sterols, plant sterol margarines, etc. Again, both in the US and Canada. We've got health claims for soy and therefore legume products by inference in Canada, the US. We've really, what we're saying is that the sorts of things that we're promoting are those things that are the main pillars of cholesterol lowering, which are accepted for health claims by our health agencies. So it wasn't a big surprise to do that. The only thing that one takes some credit for is that some of the early work that we did in some of these areas, the sticky fibers, the oats and barley, these sort of things that are used, we did some of the early work in the area of viscous fibers, for example. So one takes some credit for that. One worked very early on soy proteins. So one takes some credit for the work done on soy. In these ways, one takes a little credit, if you like. We did work on nuts too, which I think helped to get the health claim. So we did work on the components. But I say it's my wife's idea that we should put them together, because she said you're only getting about 4 or 5% or 6%, maybe a bit more in terms of cholesterol lowering. And that really isn't matching up with what the drugs are doing. So, I mean, you're never going to win. Why don't you put them together? And so we thought, why not do a sort of financial portfolio, as it were, spread your risks and benefits. over a range of things. And that's what diet is. It's a range. You eat a range of foods. You don't eat just one food. So we thought we'll put them all together, and you've got literally a handful. And will that make a difference? And so we reckon, well, even if they just add up, they'll make a difference. We'd hoped they might multiply, but they didn't. They added up. But they didn't cancel out. So just because you took one good food and then you took another one, it didn't cancel out. It stacked up. So that we found was exciting, and our early studies showed that, and encouraged us to go on.
So give me a sense of what that journey was like, because, you know, you're being very modest about the work that you've done that has pushed the science of nutrition forward. And you've said that your wife was the one that came up with the idea of actually creating a diet. But I mean, the work that led you to that position, when did you start? What inspired you to start on this path? And when did you start saying, you know what, we need to get some science behind this nutrition game and really track, you know, how it affects the body? How did you get to that place?
Well, I got to that point quite early on because we were doing metabolic studies that related to diabetes. And that was in my sort of, my undergraduate period. So that was the driver. And when I was convinced that I should do a PhD, the lab that I did it in Oxford was also shared. It was the Human Physiology Laboratory, was also shared by Dr. Bob Good. Now, it became Dr. Bob Good. He was just Bob Good in those days, who'd actually come from Toronto.
Right.
And he'd worked with Dr. Alec Little, who's one of the sort of doyens of lipidology in Canada. And they'd worked on plant-based diets and showed that those had lowered serum cholesterol. So Bob said to me, why are you messing around? Why don't you work with plant-based diets? And I said, well, that's fine. Let's take a look. And so some of the early studies we did on plant-based diets were inspired by, if you like, a Toronto connection, because he was literally sitting in the next seat in the laboratory in which I worked. So that was the introduction. He was one of the early volunteers, actually, to take the diet. So right. That was fun. And we didn't make a great deal out of it because it was all part of a metabolic spectrum. It's different sort of things, viscous fibers, that sort of thing. But it was instrumental in opening one's mind to the concept that might be useful. And then you have to fast forward quite a while more as I went through my medical training and was trained in gastroenterology by Dr. Francis Avery Jones, who's one of the father figures of British gastroenterology, and right. Internationally too. And he was very, very close friends with Richard Doll of the smoking fame. And the two of them were very keen on the new ideas that Dennis Burkitt, they were new then, was just bringing back with Hugh Trowell from Africa, from Uganda, where they'd found that what they thought was unprocessed carbohydrates, probably dietary fiber, hence the term dietary fiber in a way. They found that this was very common in people in Uganda who didn't suffer from any of the Western diseases. So they went to the British Medical Research Council and said, look, why don't we do some work on this? And it was fortuitous because I was hanging around, and Dr. Avery Jones and Dr. Richard Doll said to me, why don't you work in this area? So I thought, well, I mean, I'll do the metabolic side, and John Cummings did the colon side. And we worked at the London Medical Research Council Clinical Gastroenterology Unit at Central Middlesex Hospital. And the rest, in a way, was sort of a continuation of that.
So give us a sense of when was that happening? So
that was happening basically. That was happening in the early 70s, 1972.
Oh, so in the very early 70s.
Very early 70s, yeah, absolutely.
So what was the prevailing wind at the time? Because if I think back, to at least from a popular culture point of view, the idea of what we call now a plant-based diet was basically, being a vegetarian, and that was really considered the purview of hippies, and no one you'd want to have over for dinner. So, I mean, what was the atmosphere like when
Well,
you said
that was true. It was very true. You're quite right. My wife used to say, my future wife used to say to me, "Why do we have to dine out with all these strange people?" So you're quite right. That was the time, and by the beginning of the 70s, after the 60s, it sort of passed on a bit, and all the people who'd been in Haight-Ashbury, sort of on the beach, taking drugs and playing guitar, had now become people with pinstripe suits on Wall Street. Do you know what I mean?
yes, we all know how that went.
There'd been a change. There had been a change. Obviously, it's a change that we've seen enormously changed over the last literally 30 to 40, 50 years. We've seen a big change in that. But at that point, people were becoming more interested in plant-based diets, and they were looking back to their roots. They were looking back to the Kellogg brothers and their sanitarium that they had in Battle Creek. They were looking back to Graham crackers and Graham flour and things that were whole. They were looking back to my grandmother's generation when health-loving people ate all bran. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Made by the Kellogg family, and that takes you back really to the last, not to the last century, but the century before that, when there was actually a movement of back to the earth and doing things naturally. So that's always been with us. It's just come back in recurrent waves. And I think what we're seeing is a bigger wave now, as these things are taking hold and somewhat more publications put behind them so that people can see some of the data. And I think that then spreads the word. So I think what you're seeing now is a greater interest in sort of things that had their origins then, with a lot of pioneers who were working at that time. And the results of their work have just gradually had an influence. And I think much more importantly, than that, I think there's been an environmental movement which has coincided with the plant-based movement. And with that, the recurrent theme of animal welfare and species loss on the planet, which has become a major environmental problem. So all these things have come together to make for a very strong case for moving in this direction. In fact, so much so that if we were to ask now why I was interested in nutrition and where I think nutrition should go, I would say to you quite simply, the planet is the sickest person in the room. And we've really got to look after the planet so that our main concern should be how can we feed ourselves healthily and preserve and promote the planet. That's what we have to do. We can't just say, to hell with the planet, what's best for us? No, we've got to make some compromises. And it may not be the ideal thing for us. It may not be the most palatable thing for us. But as long as we can live healthily, we've got to do things that are right for the planet. And I think that's where nutrition goes, to actually refine the ideas and try and find out what are the best ways of doing this so that we have planetary health as our number one and human health as our number two.
Well, presumably human health will benefit if we look after the planetary.
Well, absolutely. And as David Katz always says, what's the point of a perfect diet on a dead planet?
Right. Yes. I do really appreciate how you tied in, the great forces that are at work in our culture today, the environmental movement, the animal welfare movement, and then the understanding that, the data is it's clear. If you reduce, bad food, meat, and so on, and you lean towards a plant-based diet, your health outcomes will improve. And the data is there, and we actually see it in massive populations. We see what happened in China, which has moved from a plant-based diet into more of a Western-style diet, and we've seen the implications to the population there. So it's really undeniable at this point.
Well, I think the Japanese experience before that showed us this very clearly. The Japanese have been very worried as they've given up their tofu and vegetables for Kobe beef and other things. Their health from being absolutely stellar and probably the best on the face of the planet has gone down.
Yeah.
Their height has increased. So if you're just looking for height, you can grow taller. But, as they say, the taller they are, the harder they fall. So that one has to be a little bit careful there.
Well, you did say that the planet is the sickest person in the room. So maybe that's a good segue for us to move to, let's talk about specifically about the portfolio diet. And I know that there's a tremendous amount of work and research that has gone into informing that and creating the portfolio diet. But we'll just use that as a catch-all phrase for the work you've done. And it's really about cholesterol, isn't it? Because one of the outcomes of this mad diet and mad lifestyle that we're all on today is heart disease and cholesterol. And you've shown that your portfolio diet actually has a radical effect on cholesterol. So could you just take us a little bit through that, and maybe you can particularly compare and contrast it to the use of statins?
Well, I think probably what one should do is go back to the original diet that was, if you like, the forebear of the dietary portfolio. And that was, in fact, one of the diets that interested my wife. And she said, this is a major advance, but you're doing many things with it. And what we did was we tried to think, as you're saying, cholesterol seems to be a problem now. Does that mean that cholesterol has always been a problem for Homo sapiens? And we look back and, there's a sort of paleo diet. But to be very honest, the paleo diet is a relatively recent diet. It's only about sort of, in its sort of standard form, is perhaps only about 100,000 years. Our species, it's true, as our species has only been around 100, 200 or so, 1,000 years. So we've only been paleos for half. And the greater part of our time was pre-Homo sapiens, and really in conjunction with the great apes. And that's where I'm sure a great deal of our gastrointestinal physiology was developed during that particular period. And if we look at all our great ape cousins, they eat a diet which is very different from the supermarket diet that we eat.
Paint a picture for us of that diet, so that's 100,000 years ago ish.
This is more than that. Let's go back pre-Homo sapiens.
Okay.
So you're going to be talking about 1 to 2 million years ago.
Good Lord.
So I think that's the sort of time frame that one wants, and you've got evolution of that diet over the previous 5 to 10 million years. Do you know what I mean? So that's going to be where a major part of the genetic change is going to have taken place that differentiates us from very different creatures from what we are today.
And how do you get a sense of what that diet might have been? You're moving back into the darkness of the history.
You can't actually do that. You can never find out, because, to be honest, a lot of the foods, plant foods, for example, which were probably eaten quite a lot, disappear, and all you see are shells and bones. This is all you have. It's almost a fossil record, so it doesn't really tell you, unless you're careful and very, very skillful, and you can work out from what the pollens were that were around at the time. Then you can possibly work out what was being eaten. You may get some coprolites from some of the creatures, and you may again be able to find some of the pond species there. But again, it doesn't tell you what the bulk of the food was that was eaten. You can only get a snapshot, so it may or may not be accurate. So the best way that we thought is to project back. If you take all the great apes and you find out all of them are eating, are there some commonalities? Because that at least could take you back, as it were, to what might be more common. And in fact, there are. And we're not so far off when we talk about high fiber diets, because even our own species, in terms of the Bushmen and these sort of people, are more primitive versions of ourselves in terms of lifestyle. They would eat much higher fiber diets than we do. And there'd be no processed foods, or very little processed food in terms of what they're doing. The processing would be cooking, if they do, if that.
Right.
So I think that was important for us. So we looked at what all the great apes were eating, and we came to the conclusion that there were large amounts of plant foods. And so we said, let us be hypothetical. Let us take away the bread and potatoes, as it were, and let's see what you could possibly have eaten relatively raw in the plant food domain. And that's not so dissimilar from what the chimpanzees and the gorillas do already anyway, the bonobos and so on, and the orangutans, of course, who have the fruit. So we put this sort of a diet together. It was we had to feed our people about 5.5 kilograms of food a day in order to keep their weight on. In other words, plant foods are very bulky when you eat them. Fruit and vegetables don't have many calories in them, unless you have avocado, which has got a bit more. But for that, and nuts. But apart from eating those, you don't get a lot of calories. So you have to eat a lot. Nice thing, I mean, you'll sit around with the family and you'll have meals and you'll all day and you'll a lot of bonding and a lot of discussion, but a lot of chewing.
And so, hence the molars as an evolutionary,
Yeah, a lot of chewing.
So what you're basically, you may not know this, is I actually grew up in East Africa. All of my formative years were in Kenya and very close to the Ugandan border. So seeing groups of monkeys, chimpanzees and so on, down by the river, they spend their whole day eating. I mean, if they're not cleaning each other and grooming each other, which is the social habit that they have, they're eating. So what you're basically saying is, because these early diets didn't have those, heavy starches in them and so on that will hold you, and they probably weren't eating that much meat because that's hard you got to hunt it down, you got to find it, you got to skin it, you got to cook it, it doesn't last long in the boiling sun either. So basically, because they're eating a fruit and vegetable forward diet, you need a lot of food, and so they're basically eating all the time.
Yeah.
So as we move forward, then the challenge, I suppose, as we developed and culture developed, was how do we pack more nutrition, more staying power into our diet? And that's when we started, I'm guessing, with cultivation and wheat and bread and so on, so that we didn't have to spend the whole day.
Well, yes, to be honest, and what the paleobiologists are now thinking is that probably tubers actually came into the human diet much earlier than we think. They would have come in before we had the cereals. The cereals really came in with the sort of agricultural revolution of 10,000 years ago. So relatively recently, rice, breads, these sort of things. So that's recent. But way before that, when we first cultivated fire, which was, as you say, when you haven't got fire, you can't eat much meat. So you've got to have fire. And fire was probably cultivated longer back than we thought, and some very early fire pits have been seen in other parts of the world as being a sort of regular feature. And those fire pits would have provided the hot ash that you need to bake tubers. So you could put tubers in these things and probably get a lot of starchy foods.
And when you say tubers, what exactly do you mean by that?
Root vegetables.
Right.
Root vegetables that have got that you can cook, as it were, and then become edible. Very difficult to eat them raw, so you can't. Yeah. But once you've got the fire that allows you to eat meat, you've also got the fire that will give you tuberous vegetables. And the tuberous vegetables may have been much more reliable and much more easy to come by than, as you say, the meat that you've hunted, where you may have to hunt spend some time hunting and be quite a long way away from base camp. And then you've got the energetic problem of bringing the meat back to the camp.
Right.
So in the end, you may not make, energy is the big thing, you may not make a tremendous energetic advantage. Whereas if you've got your camp surrounded by root vegetables and tubers, and you can manage to get some fire together, you're in good shape in order to be able to continue. And as many primitive tribes do, they keep the fire going. I mean, they used to say, keep the home fires burning, but this is absolutely true. These were home fires that were kept burning, and they were important until we learned how to make fire ourselves, which we did with flints and other things, so that we had learned how to make it later on. But first of all, we captured it from lightning and other things, and then kept it going, and exchanged it amongst ourselves. I mean, one tribe had fire, the other didn't. The tribe that didn't have the fire would do all sorts of things to share the fire of the people who got it. So I think that fire was important. That's why Prometheus was chained to a rock, and they allowed his liver to be pecked out by vultures or whatever.
Always one of my favorite stories of Greek mythology.
Brought fire to mortals because fire was a tricky business. It allowed us to expand, it allowed us to grow, and it allowed us to survive. And presumably the gods never wanted that. So we're defying nature, as it were, and that's what we did. We could defy nature once we had fire.
And we're still defying nature today on a daily basis. I have to say, the picture that you paint of those, prehistoric societies and the struggle for survival and going out, hunting, it's amazing that we survived, because it sounds absolutely exhausting to me, non-stop. So I just want to, so I understand now where you were, the inspiration from your work comes from, and you've had a chance now to look back and connect all the dots, if you will. I know that there was, you started your life actually as a clinician. I'm not sure, was that in conjunction to be a researcher? Did you start as a doctor and then become a researcher?
Yeah, the Oxford system was quite interesting at the time. There was a 7-year medical course.
Right.
So and you could be recruited at the beginning. You came out of school, as it were, and then you signed up for 7 years, as it were. Oxford at the time was very sort of oriented towards outward looking in many ways, possibly more than it is today. So that you did your undergraduate training,
yeah.
And you got a BA equivalent to a BSc, and then you did more pathology and bacteriology, and then you went to the med school. Most people in Oxford didn't go to the local med school, which was at Radcliffe. They would go to London because it was somewhat more fashionable. And certainly they'd go to hospitals like the Middlesex, which is a hospital in the West End,
right,
just off Oxford Street. So that was much more enjoyable because it was you were in the heart of where the action was.
Amazing you got any work done at all, actually.
Absolutely. Well, that's true. They still worked you fairly hard, but I mean, you didn't have to travel far to go to Soho. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Let me ask you this. The work that you've characterized the work that you did, I was sitting next to him on the bench and they came back from Africa and we just thought we'd do this. It's a very sort of casual story of the work which you're telling us. Let me ask you this. Did you get a sense that you were doing work? Was it just, I guess the question I'm asking, were you sort of blinkered, well, this sort of seems interesting from a scientific, point of view, and let's investigate this? Or were you saying, you know what, we really need to do some research into plant-based diets because we're going down a wrong path here and we need to, change our game?
I think you're right. I don't think I think there was always the feeling that this was an important area that needed exploration because it was important things. You never thought that what you were doing was important, but you thought you were moving in the right direction. And for many of us, that was the big thing. We all thought we were going to do something wonderful and cure cancer. Everyone thought they were going to do that.
Well, to be fair, you have done something wonderful. I mean, the fact that you've been able to show that by eating a correct diet, you can reduce your cholesterol and get off those horrible drugs you've been prescribed. I mean, that is a fantastic accomplishment.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure. I wish we'd got, as it were, to the final goalpost. But we're a long way off, and they always move the goalposts as soon as you think you're getting close. So I don't know, but I do think we all thought we were going to do something magnificently important. We didn't do it because we thought we were going to be very important. We just thought we were going to do something magnificently important because that's what everyone did. Everyone was going to do something magnificently important, and a lot of them did, and many of them didn't. But that's not because it was their fault. It was just bad luck. They didn't get there. So I think that no one thought at the time that what they were doing was groundbreaking. I have to say that. We did all think that the people who were senior, who'd done really interesting things like Burkitt with Burkitt's lymphoma, who from Africa and so on, we all thought that they were really interesting people. And I think that we thought that it was really worth doing, following up on the leads that they'd given us and for which we were grateful. So I think that was really the spirit of it. You sort of pushed ahead doing something you thought was useful, and you were quite sure it was going to get somewhere brilliant, which it may never do. And I think there was possibly more hope and less rigor and excellence than one sees today. Whereas you say you keep the blinkers on, you've got to get things done. You've got to get the right grade. After you've got the right grade, you've got to do the right you've got to go into the right laboratory. You've got to have the right supervisor. You've got to closely supervise. You've got to focus on what you're doing, and then you'll go to the next stage, and there'll be another hurdle you'll go through. And you've got tenure. You've got to think about tenure. You've got to then think about promotion, and you've got to. Well, we didn't have all those things. I mean, I was just lucky. My mentor said, look, here's the Medical Research Council. They'll give you a grant. You just go and do research for 7 years.
So do you believe then, so here's a question for you. There's a couple of things that come to mind as you tell me that story and describe the environment, not only today, but what it was like back then. Was it a more creative time? And the second part of the question is, one of the things that we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years is this incredible focus on intellectual property, right? And in fact, a litigious focus on intellectual property. And basically creating a situation where researchers are working in silos and they can't share their information because it's all bound by, intellectual property and held by corporations or some form of corporate entity. Could you comment on that? And what effect do you think that's had on the ability of researchers and creative thinkers like yourselves to actually be able to do their best work?
Well, I have to say, I've been very lucky in that when I've had help, as I have very often from industry, it's been open-handed. So I've not been restricted in what I've said or what I've done. And I've had a lot of help from industrial friends and colleagues. So, and they've even done analyses and other things that we couldn't possibly do ourselves. So I can't speak directly to the issue that you're talking about, although I do understand that for many it may be a big issue. Perhaps it's always been a big issue. But I think that there was less intensity in the past, and I think things were more easygoing. I mean, if you think about it, regulations have to be made. we say. I'm not sure that it's true, but we all assume that life has to get more and more and more regulated, and it is. So we're getting what we ask for, which is more regulation. And I think once you get more regulation, then you do indeed tend to encourage these sorts of, there's less looseness in the system. It becomes more strict, more regulated, and you've got more rigor, more excellence, and everything is done so much better. I'm not sure it is always done better, to be honest. I think it's done more regulated. I think there's more bureaucracy. I think you have many more forms to fill in. I'm not sure that filling in more forms makes it better, but that is the common belief now. The common belief is that once you've got plenty of forms to fill in, it's better. And I think that once people are excellent in filling out forms quickly, they're better people because they can be quicker with the forms and more accurate.
Dr. Jenkins, you really don't want to get me started on that one. But I want to finish with a couple of questions here for you. You have a lifetime of work in this area behind you. You have experience working with patients. And one of the things we always try and do right here on Nutramedica is we try and make sure that our programs help practitioners do a better job of helping their patients. So what I want to ask you right now is that one of the most difficult things, and I think there's even some kind of a joke about it. I can't remember it off the top of my head, or an expression, an idiom, is it's how difficult it is to get people to change their diet. Like, I have a heart attack, but within 6 months I'm back on the pizza and so on. It's very difficult to get people to actually change their diets. And now you have, over the years and the work that you've done, and your wife as well, you've developed this diet, which we call the portfolio diet now. And we have a practitioner sitting down in front of their patient who has a cholesterol issue, has a cardiovascular issue. What are you going to say to that patient to help them save their own life?
Well, I think that one of my colleagues, John Siebenpiper, has a very good approach that he uses in his clinic. And I think it needs more publicity. He takes out a prescription script and he writes down, for example, the 4 pillars of the dietary portfolio, which and puts it in fruit and vegetables, how many fruit and vegetables a day, these sort of things. And he writes out his prescription. So how much oat bran and whatever you should have a day, how much soy, bean products you should have a day, whether you should have a plant sterol sauce a day, what sort of viscous fiber sources, oats, barley, these sort of things you have a day. He puts down how many grams and how much you should have of these sort of things, just in very simple form. After having asked them what sort of things do you enjoy eating, then he writes out a prescription based on what they enjoy eating that would actually cement in the things that are useful, and hands them the prescription and said, you can go to the supermarket and get this. And that he finds is very useful and impactful. And when if he keeps a copy in the chart, in the patient chart, he can check up on them when they come back. And that is a very useful way of getting people to change. I find there's another useful way that we've been using, and it does have an effect. It's slow and it's not sort of dramatic. But after giving them our sort of sheets of paper, which is too much for them in many ways, one keeps it simple and say, take a more plant-based diet, have some more sources of sticky fibers like oats and barley, perhaps have some psyllium, perhaps sometimes with it. Don't be afraid of eating nuts. Eat nuts, but eat them very often with other good foods like some nuts and an apple. That's actually quite a good lunch if you're overweight and you want to lose a little weight. Do these sorts of things that are simple. Outline a few of them, and then talk to them a little bit, just for a few seconds, about the environment and the impact that we've got there, and the fact that this is going to be good for the planet and for their children. And so it's a diet that really helps everything. And so give them some sort of extra reason, apart from a cholesterol number, that they should be doing the diet. Because I think very often the cholesterol number, it's important and they should know it and they should stick with that. But it's not a major driver. That's the trouble. Whereas if you talk about these other things, they become little extra drivers that people need. And they look at their children, and instead of seeing, well, what shall I eat? They think, well, what shall I not eat? Do you know what I mean? And I think that's useful. So those are the things I know. I have to say that I do not have the answer to this. If I did, I wouldn't be here right now. I'd be on some major show talking about, I was almost dead with exhaustion, and talking about how we're achieving it. So I don't have the answer, but these are tips that may work with people.
Well, I thank you. I thank you for that. So let's finish right here. We hear every day of the epidemic of obesity that is plaguing the West and starting to plague developing countries as well as they change their diets. Fast food outlets on every corner, delivery food services, condos made with kitchens the size of postage stamps. Do we have any right to feel optimistic about the future?
I think if we manage to turn the corner to more plant-based diets, I think we've got some hope for the future. I think if we don't do that in a concerted fashion, then I think we haven't got hope, and possibly we don't deserve hope.
Right. And it's not only a personal health story, as you mentioned off the top, it's also a planetary health story. Correct. And it's also an animal welfare and well-being story, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's been a real pleasure meeting you and talking with you today, Dr. Jenkins. I thank you for joining us on Nutramedica.
Well, thank you, Brian, and take care.
I will.
Eat well and take care.
I'm going to go and have a salad right now with some nuts. Well, folks, on Nutramedica, you saw it right here. We share the insight and experience of expert natural health clinicians and researchers every day. And the interview with Dr. David Jenkins today was no exception. If you enjoyed the program, please let us know by liking the video. We always appreciate your feedback, so don't forget to speak up in the comments. Now, here's a personal invitation. If you have an area of expertise that you would like to share with our healing community, we would love to hear about it. Just send us an email telling us a little bit about yourself and your area of expertise to nutramedica@nfh.ca. On behalf of the entire Nutramedica team, thank you for the work that you do every day. You're changing the world one patient at a time. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.